officers in Chicago are threatening to shut down the city's shopping district this Black Friday. This comes after police released video of an officer fatally shooting a black teenager. Jason Van Dyke is now charged with first-degree murder for the death of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald, who was shot 16 times. While the protests have been mostly peaceful, last night vandals targeted the city Christmas tree. Anna Yam is a former prosecutor, and criminal defense attorney Brian Claypool is a defense attorney. Hey, it's nice to see you both.
Nice to see you, Leah. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
And happy Thanksgiving to you. So this is the first time a Chicago police officer in decades has been charged with murder for an on-duty shooting. And let's start with you. How does the prosecution go about this?
The prosecution is going to have a lot of evidence to go about this. I think that self-defense, in terms of what the defense is arguing, is going to be very difficult because a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this case, a video is worth 1,000 words. Chicago is my hometown, and I hate to see what's going on over there. But if you think about self-defense, self-defense is about the reasonable belief that it's necessary to defend against imminent great bodily injury or death. And if you look at that video, Laquan McDonald is 10 feet away from the officer when he fires shots. And not only that, but Laquan McDonald is on the ground for at least 14 or 15 seconds while the officer is emptying his clip. I think self-defense is going to be a big burden for the defense here, and I think the prosecution has a strong case.
Yeah, and you know, Anna, watching that video is horrible for anyone to see. It is a painful video to watch. But Brian, let's turn to you. How does the defense go about this?
Well, like Anna said, there's not much of a defense in this case. I mean, the only argument you can make for the police officer here is that McDonald was walking in the middle of the street. He had a knife in his hand, so he does pose a threat to the officer. But the problem with that is that at the time he shot, he's 10 feet away from the officer. He's not charging the officer, so he's not posing an immediate threat of grave harm to the officer. But most importantly is this fact. Once he's shot and he's on the ground, 15 more shots follow. And under the law, a police officer has to justify each and every shot. In other words, every time you pull that trigger, you have to justify pulling that trigger. It's not one snapshot of 16 shots. It's 16 separate snapshots of each individual shot. So I think in this case, there's a very strong case that this officer will be convicted, but not of first-degree murder. It's more like manslaughter or possibly second-degree murder.
And Anna, that's because it's hard to get a conviction for first-degree murder in this type of case?
I think so. I think that we as a society would like to believe that our officers protect and serve. And the majority of the officers, I work with plenty of them, both when I was a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, a lot of officers are brave and honorable and serve our country and protect and serve. But in this type of situation, it's going to be difficult for the defense to argue that this officer was reasonably in belief of defending himself. Now, on the flip side, if the defense argues, well, Laquan McDonald did have a knife and he didn't want to wait for someone to be stabbed before acting, he could make that argument, but in my opinion, that doesn't really fall under the theory of self-defense. But it could resonate with certain jurors.
Brian, let's turn to you. You know, the bigger picture. So far, the protests have been pretty much peaceful, but a lot of people are gathering outside Mayor Rahm Emanuel's office. What would your advice be to him at this point and how to handle this?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I think the reason why people are protesting in Chicago, well, there's three reasons why. There's a complete lack of leadership, both in Chicago and nationally. Let's start with the police chief for failing to properly train and vet and supervise this police officer. He had 18 to 20 prior complaints, including a complaint of racial animus. Why wasn't he either removed from the police force or retrained and given sensitivity training? Let's go up the chain. Then you got the state attorney who doesn't even bring down an indictment until she knows that the video is going to come out. Whoops, right. The video's coming out. I better have him indicted.
The timing is
then you've got Rahm Emanuel. The only thing Rahm Emanuel says is, oh, is this going to divide us or unify us? That's ridiculous. He needs to be appointing a special prosecutor. He needs to demand an independent investigation and to look at whether this is a systemic problem within the police department. And then lastly, you've got nobody at the federal level saying, hey, let's get the U.S. attorney involved because there is an issue of racial animus here. Why hasn't that happened?
Right.
And then, two other things.
Might
Sure.
I add, though,
Anna, go
based
ahead.
upon your point, Brian, is that a prosecutor should never file a decision based upon the fear of protest or how the people are going to react to it. If the evidence is there and if a prosecutor believes beyond a reasonable
Right.
doubt that they can convict, they should have filed this a long time ago, not wait
Right.
until
That's a
after
great
the
point.
video is released.
And that's a really good point
That's
that you
a great-
bring up, you know, and maybe you can respond to it, Brian. You know, these charges came and the video was released a year after this all happened?
Right, Lee, and that creates the second and third problem I was going to talk about. There's a lack of transparency with law enforcement, not only in Chicago, but nationwide. There's no transparency here at all. You're hiding this video, hoping nobody's going to find out about it, and whoops, if they do, we better hurry up and indict. No transparency, and
Right.
the last problem we have is there's a complete lack of trust. Like Anna said, when you've got a prosecutor, a state attorney that's not charging an officer that should be charged, when you've got a mayor that's not taking a leadership role, when you've got a police chief who knows he's got an unfit officer and that police chief does nothing, and then you've got the federal government, and no offense to Hillary Clinton, but then she makes a comment like, oh, yeah, I hope we get accountability, but there's a ton of good police officers. That doesn't help either. We're not talking about
that's
all
right.
the other police officers.
Well, we're going to have
talking
to
about
leave it
this
at that, but
officer in
thank you.
Chicago.
Thank you to both of you, Anna Yum and Brian Claypool. Hopefully those protests continue to
bet.
be peaceful. Hopefully the city does something about this to make everyone feel better and to move forward. Leland?